Thank you. All right. Today we're going to be talking about the crisis in Ukraine. And I'm going to start, you could start in the 19th century or even earlier. I'm going to start with the collapse of the Soviet Union and give the background to the present crisis. So we're going to talk about, very briefly, like literally one sentence, what Ukraine was like under the Soviet Union, how that changed during the privatization era in the 90s, and then what impact the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the financial crisis in 2008 have had on the Ukraine that is now basically in the middle of a civil war. So, and then once we do that, I'm going to go through step by step from November of last year up until about a week ago, and just to give you an indication of how much of a problem this is. When I started working on this presentation a week ago, Slavyansk, which you can see in Donetsk province up here on the map, which is one of the major centers of the insurgency in the east, that was under the control of the rebels, and 2 days ago it was taken back by the government. So just in the last 7 days between when I started thinking about talking about this and today, there's been major shifts in the geopolitical situation. So it's, I don't know, the blow-by-blow stuff isn't going to be as useful maybe, but the point of this is to also give you the background, so that'll be helpful the more you read about it. So in the Soviet period, one thing about the Soviet Union is that the normal kind of capitalist pattern where you invest in a foreign country and extract as much value as you can, and you deindustrialize a colonial country as much as possible so that you can have, the high value-added production in your own country and then sell goods, and get the raw materials and things like that. In the Soviet Union, that pattern was inverted a little bit. And the Soviet, you could call them, if you want to call them colonies, the Soviet states that were not Russia received a tremendous amount of investment. There's an aluminum plant in Tajikistan that to this day is a quarter of the economic activity in that country, and that it was something that was built by the Soviet Union for the express purpose of industrializing that country. And Ukraine was probably the best example of this type of investment. There was a lot of rocket building, a lot of airplane construction. They built a lot of computers. There was traditional industries like steel and coal, particularly in the east. Here are these two provinces on the far east. But it was not at all the traditional pattern of the metropole with all of the industry and the colony with all of the slave labor and the just kind of raw resource extraction. There's a lot of very high-tech production going on in Ukraine in the 80s. Now in the 90s, what happens is there's a fire sale privatization. The Soviet Union collapses. There's a new government that's inaugurated in Ukraine, and they have no interest in maintaining socialism. So two things happen. First of all, there's the privatization, like I said. There's basically a gift from the state, from the Soviet state, to different groups of oligarchs. They get these huge factories for almost nothing. So that's the first effect. So you have a small group of people who take control of the whole economy of Ukraine. And they don't have any interest really in bringing it up to speed with the West, which could have been done. Ukrainian industry was a little bit, in efficiency terms, it was a little bit behind the West. That could have been fixed if they had been willing to invest in it, but they weren't. What's happened is these oligarchs have taken the factories that they owned and shipped the money that they make out, mainly to Cyprus. That's the main kind of offshore tax haven for Ukraine. So that's the first thing, privatization. The second thing is that the Soviet Union and all of its republics were, they had a plan, and everything, production was coordinated across national boundaries. The Soviet Union produced a certain thing, and Ukraine produced another thing. Ukraine made a lot of tanks and aircraft, like we were talking about. And when the Soviet Union is gone, all of a sudden these kind of trade relationships, these production relationships across borders don't exist anymore. So you have a factory that requires all these inputs, and it used to be that you would get them from a different country, but now that country won't trade with you. So what happens? And what happened in Ukraine is that, first of all, economy was subject to competition from abroad, and that destroyed a lot of firms on its own. But there was just this fundamental like breakdown in like the way that they would build things. Like a lot of these old relationships that allowed, you know, the aluminum or whatever to come into the country to be turned into aircraft, like that just didn't happen anymore, like because there was nobody was bothering to coordinate that because there was no plan. So a lot of this kind of high-tech industry that was safer and also more like capital intensive and required like a more educated workforce, a lot of that disappears. What is left is used to make money for oligarchs as long as it's still around, and when those businesses fail, you know, no effort is made to like bring them back. It's just you take the money out and run, basically. So that's the economy, and during the 90s there were a number of political effects. Obviously you need a different government for all of this. One thing that's interesting about Ukraine that has played into the crisis is that there was no outright dictatorship or like strong authoritarian like presidential power. Like Yeltsin sent tanks into Moscow to, you know, stop the parliamentary proceedings in 1993, and that could not have happened in the Ukraine. And it's not because there was this like democratic culture and like dissent and everything. It's because Ukraine is a very divided country, and it's divided. Yes, here we go. And it's divided along along ethnic and linguistic lines. And you can see to the east here. That's weird. What was that? The brown line. The east is Russian, basically. There's a small Crimean Tatar population down here. There's a few Poles, I think, in the north. Yeah.
Do you mind pointing up for the people?
Oh yeah, right. I'm pointing, like you can see that. The east, these two provinces on the east correspond to these two here, Donetsk and Luhansk. Those are like the places where the People's Republics are now. We're going to talk about those later. You can also notice if I flip back and forth, you know, you get a seizure. But those are the Russian, that's in the Russian-speaking area. And this is, the red area is mostly Ukrainian-speaking. And then you can see there's a mix in the middle here. This actually matters a lot less than you would think if you grow up in Ukraine, then you speak Ukrainian and you speak Russian. And there's even a point where if you only know one language, there's a certain amount of the other language that you can understand. So this isn't some kind of like age-old, like they don't understand each other at all and they've been just thrown together. It's not like a Middle East like mandate, like invented border type thing. There is a lot of like common culture between these two groups, but they are separate, and politics in Ukraine has been separated along ethnic lines to the point where one Ukrainian sociologist that I read an interview with said that immediately whenever any president is elected, half of the population, like day one, half of the population doesn't trust him at all and expects him to be corrupt and you know, to shortchange them. And it helps that almost every single Ukrainian president has been extremely corrupt and has done exactly, you know, favored his party, his ethnicity over the other. So that's the ethnic thing. There's also something else connected to privatization. There are two main kind of groups of oligarchs in Ukraine. It's not just this one kind of like, you know, council or whatever. In every situation, there's the oligarchs that did really well in privatization and the oligarchs that did less well, or the small businessmen who, you know, through luck and pluck have kind of like started their own business and they're making more money. The lower guys, the party of millionaires, as they're referred to, would prefer for Ukraine to be more isolated from the world market because, as I discussed earlier, the world market came into Ukraine, wrecked most of its industry, dragged it back down this kind of ladder of production back to like selling coal and steel and like agricultural products. And if you're a middle business owner who has like, you know, you make a lot of money and you have a fairly big business, but it's not big enough that you can weather like these huge storms. If you're like that, then you want Ukraine to be more isolated, and a free trade pact, for instance, is not really in your best interest. On the other hand, if you're one of the party of billionaires, if you did really well during privatization and you have huge firms, you know, there's one, I forget his name, Artsemov or something, who is in this eastern area, and he controls a lot of the coal mines. He employs like 300,000 people, I think, or maybe it was 30,000. Anyway, it's a lot of people. If you're somebody like that, and all of your money is sitting in Cyprus gathering interest, you don't care necessarily about the Ukrainian economy, because actually your goal now is to get out of Ukraine. Your goal is to take your capital and invest it, somewhere else. And when, you have a government that isn't as keen on free trade, that's harder to do. And this is another. So there's the ethnic tension. There's also the tension between the groups of oligarchs in the country, between opening Ukraine up and keeping Ukraine relatively closed off from the economy. And opening up in this case means joining the European Union or joining a customs union with Russia. And that's the other thing, right? Which one do we join? Like if we're gonna get into a free trade agreement, who do we do it with? That's the third kind of big question in Ukrainian politics. At least it has been since '91. Okay, so we're going to jump forward. So I should mention that there's a 1996 Constitution, because you'll hear me refer to this, the 96 Constitution and the 2004 Constitution. The 96 Constitution gives more power to the Parliament and the political parties in the Parliament than it does to the President, which is the exact opposite of what you see in places like Russia or Belarus. And again, it's because of this kind of contentious culture I've talked about before. So that's 96. The next constitution comes in the wake of the Orange Revolution in 2004. And this is one of these color revolutions that you've heard about. There was one in Georgia. I forget which color was that? Was it like...
In Georgia, I don't know, but it was orange in Ukraine.
Orange, yeah, it was orange in Ukraine. There was one in Georgia. Pink or something. I don't know what it was. There was several of these. And there was like the blue one in Kazakhstan or something. I don't know. Anyway, so during the Orange Revolution in 2004, it's a revolution, but it lasts about 3 weeks. It was very peaceful. And what happens is basically one group of oligarchs is changed for a different one. The interests of one group are promoted over the interests of the other. And the 2004 Constitution gives more power to the president and less power to the Parliament, to the parties. And what that does is, wait, I had that wrong. What did I say? It gives more power to the Parliament and less to the president. Is that what I said? That's what I have written here. So that's what it is. More power to the parties. And this represents a move away from the presidential authoritarian style. And this is more in the interests of the oligarchs, because the oligarchs control most of the major media, or the billionaires, I should say, that particular party. Because the oligarchs in that party control, they don't just have their small businesses, they have their very large businesses, and they also own most of the media, and indirectly own most of the political parties in Ukraine, which are basically kind of traditional like vote-getting machines like the Democrats or Republicans here. So that happens in 2004. After that, we have the economic crisis, and already the Ukrainian economy wasn't doing very well. The internal market wasn't that good because people weren't making that much money because there weren't that many good jobs. And also a lot of the things that Ukraine had been able to produce for itself, like consumer goods and airplanes and capital, like machines, a lot of that had gone away. So when the internal market stinks, right, and you don't produce a lot of things internally, you need to go abroad, right? You need to get your, big machines or your cars or even your, just PlayStations or whatever from outside of the country. So you need to generate money somehow internally in the country to pay for that. And the way that Ukraine did that is by selling food, staple products, coal, steel, and also by running up a lot of debt, basically, because they weren't able to balance that. And during the economic crisis starting in 2008, a lot of businesses in Ukraine failed, so there was a need for more products built outside of Ukraine because there was even less capacity in Ukraine to produce these things. And at the same time, obviously people were making less money, and the demand for Ukrainian exports like coal or steel or grain, whatever, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, demand for all these things goes down. So it's a tremendous crunch. And in 2010, Yanukovych is elected, and he's the guy who recently fled for Russia, so he's not in power anymore, but he was elected in 2010. And he tries to go back to the 96 Constitution to get himself more power. He does that successfully, so that's strike one against him, right? He's angered people by doing that. Strike two is that he's extremely corrupt in a way that, well, every person, every like proper name I mention in this presentation is, you can assume that they're corrupt if they're in Ukrainian politics. If they have any money at all, like chances, if they own anything in Ukraine of any like size, they got it in a corrupt way because they knew somebody as the Soviet Union was collapsing. So Yanukovych is not uniquely bad. He was probably not as smart about it as other people have been. He built himself a huge mansion, gave all kinds of special lucrative contracts to his family. Like, it was, you know, and this was sort of tolerated, I guess, until he does two other stupid things. This is a consistent theme with him. The first stupid thing he does is he tries to implement an austerity program to get IMF credits to pay off some of this debt or restructure it or whatever. And the IMF tells him to do a lot of terrible things. To be fair, it's not entirely his fault. The IMF never never has good advice for countries. They always say, you know, in this case they suggested that he charge more for gas, I think, and cut public employee roles and like get rid of pensions and things like that. So that makes him unpopular. It's not technically his fault. He was in kind of in a rough situation, but it was blamed on him. And the other thing he does is, before he was elected, actually while he was campaigning to be elected, he promised that he would sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. And he's elected, 3 years, he kind of stalls, and eventually he rejects it, and he makes it public in November of last year, the 20th, I guess, of November of last year. He says, no, we're not going to go through with this trade agreement. And he doesn't even say, fuck the EU. He doesn't say that. He's still on board with the EU. He still kind of wants to join the European Union. He's more interested in that than he is in joining a Russian customs union, I think. But he was just kind of worried about some of the terms. Just there was kind of like this fine print that he wasn't quite sure about. He wanted to delay the process a little bit. Or maybe he was like looking at this kind of dichotomy that we've talked about, where there's a lot of very powerful people who want Ukraine to be more open to the world economy, and then there's a lot of other equally powerful people who don't want that to happen. He may have been in the middle saying, well, my strategy here should be to just kind of delay, or maybe that's what was going through his head. I'm not sure. But at any rate, he says we're not going to sign a free trade agreement. And this is especially bad, and this is what actually starts the protests, the Maidan protests, which means square. Maidan means square in Ukrainian. This starts it because he had made a promise, and he's alienating now the kind of middle class and the students in Kiev and these other large cities in Ukraine. Kiev is in the very center. You can see it there. And it's firmly in the Ukrainian area of Ukraine. So, and this is what begins the Maidan protests. And part of it, there's a number of different reasons why people in Ukraine might want to join the European Union, even if you weren't an oligarch. If you're in this western part of Ukraine, the economic situation there is even worse than it is in the east, and a lot of people there are guest workers in other countries. And if Ukraine hypothetically were to be more integrated with Europe, it would be easier for these people to get. People literally die trying to get into the Schengen zone, which is the kind of the part of Europe where you don't. It's like passing from Utah to Colorado or something. Like, you don't have to show papers, you know. But getting in there is like going into a different country. You have to, you know, be documented. And there's people. It's sort of like here, getting across the desert. It's not as bad, but people do die trying to go work in Europe. So if it were easier for Ukrainians who don't have any jobs in their hometown to leave and get money and send it back, that would be in their interest. So that's one reason why people came onto the streets in November, because they saw this kind of integration that they were expecting would have a material benefit for them. And no, it's not. No, it's not going to happen. And there are also a lot of intellectuals and students who think of themselves as like culturally more European and want to distance themselves from, you know, the Asiatic bear, Russia. They want to get, you know, more into that kind of like what they think of as like cosmopolitan, like European life. And this seemed to be like a symbol of, Ukraine rejecting that, and they were unhappy with that. So from the start, it was middle class students, intellectuals, people like that from the very beginning, and this is going to change. The class character of the protest is going to change, but from the very beginning, it was anti-Russian. It was pro-Europe, anti-Russian. Like we're afraid of Putin. We're afraid of like getting pulled back into the the Soviet sphere or whatever, and we want to be European. So keep that in mind, because that's going to be a constant throughout the protest. The people that show up are going to be different, but that's going to stay the same. So we have, I don't know how many mistakes Yanukovych has made yet. He's made like 4, I think, at this point, or 5. He makes several more. This guy fucks up. He gets so many chances. The next thing he does is, as the protests are winding down, there's a kind of an Occupy style like encampment in the main square in Kiev. He doesn't wait for it to die down. He waits until it's about to die down, and then he sends in riot cops to like clear the square in an extremely brutal manner. The riot cops in these protests, they kill people and they like break bones. It's not like the Berkeley just spraying like what was that guy, Scott something, the Iraq War veteran who got hit with a flashbang. It's like that. That was in Oakland. Yeah, it's like that. Like every protest, 30 of those people at least. You see people get injured or whatever, and it's like they're in the hospital. They lost 2 quarts of blood or something like that. So it's not like it's a very like hardcore like military style eviction. And most importantly, all of the oligarchs who have now turned on Yanukovych and own TV stations and radio stations and newspapers, now that he's rejected this agreement, so he's on their bad side, right? And they have access to all these 24-hour news channels. They cover this live in real time, and they devote all kinds of coverage to people's bloody faces and mothers crying and stuff like that for the next several days, to play up like the brutality of the government and to expose Yanukovych as this corrupt dictator who just doesn't listen to the people, which is totally true. But the oligarchs who own those TV stations were perfectly fine with him being that way for the first 3 years of his presidency. So anyway, I just want to point out, there's nothing wrong with putting a bloodied face on TV and saying, look at this is horrible what happened to this person. There is something wrong with selectively deciding to like highlight particular instances of violence and saying, well, this man is bad. And obviously it's coming from a standpoint that is not like necessarily charitable. So anyway, so after the eviction, the first eviction from the square, the kind of composition of the groups begins to change, because there was always, like I said, the middle class, students, intellectuals. Now it becomes more about who is the most militant in the protest, who can stand up to like direct violence. And the elements, and these people were always here, now they become more prominent. The right sector and Svoboda and outright neo-Nazis. This is Maidan. I didn't show this. This is what it looked like. Huge demonstrations, like the biggest in Ukrainian history. And you can see all the people there. And this is when it was kind of this is before like it started to trail off. This is like at the high point.
Is that the capital?
I'm not sure where this is. I had to look at let's see. Yeah, I can read the sign. It doesn't really say anything. No, it doesn't say like this is Kiev, like right here. So that's at the high point. These guys are, I think the Ukrainian, like the Patriots of Ukraine or something, and that is you can't see that, that's a wolf's angle. That's a like explicit Nazi, oh, sorry. Yeah, right here. This thing. That's the wolf's angle. That's that's not like a crypto-Nazi symbol or like some kind of thing that you could interpret as being, it's a swastika, but it's going the other way. It's not that. This is literally was on like, not just normal Wehrmacht army uniforms, but like the special SS, like people who would go around committing genocide. That is the symbol that they did that under, and that's what these people have on their armbands, right? So, and you can look at them, they look pretty tough. A lot of them are wearing military gear. There's a lot of military experience on the right in Ukraine, and they were conducting like military drills in the streets even before the first eviction of the square. And this, people kind of made fun of them. You can imagine like these students who are dreaming of like the European dream, like setting up their kind of Occupy protest camp and having like a bicycle powered like computer or something like that. And then these guys like right next to them doing the same thing. And so it was a diverse movement to begin with. The diversity starts to change once the level of violence ratchets up and people like this start to become more and more prominent. Okay, so that's his next mistake. And even this, Yanukovych gets one more chance. He gets another chance. Even now, people aren't calling for him to leave. They're merely calling for a compromise. They want to go back to the old constitution where the president didn't have as much power. A couple hundred people were taken prisoner when they evicted the square, and they want those people released. They also want, They also want the like riot police units that carried this action out and like kicked the shit out of people to be disbanded or some kind of disciplinary action. So these are still not really revolutionary demands. They want to go back to a constitution that the country already operated under. They're not really proposing anything new. They want their friends to be let out of jail, and they want the police to be punished. Like that's, you know, after all of this, after all of his blunders, like that's the most that people want out of Yanukovych. And these people like this probably want to kill him, right? People like this probably want to kill Yanukovych at this point, but they're not the majority in the movement yet. They don't get to like set the agenda. That comes later. So Yanukovych's final mistake is to, and this is like insult to injury, this is the worst thing he does. He doesn't let the parliament even begin to debate the bill that would change the Constitution. Somebody puts the bill forward and he has, you know, his party in the parliament like obstruct it. So he didn't even let people begin to debate it in an official way. And this obviously incenses everybody at the Maidan, and they hold a rally, kind of spontaneously decide to go down to parliament and demand that the bill be tabled. They're, you know, not only does that not have any effect, Yanukovych orders the riot police in, and how many people? Several people are killed. I think it's like 10 or 20 people are actually outright like murdered by riot police because they came to the parliament. And they didn't, again, they're not asking him to resign yet. This comes after he kills people. They're not asking him to resign. They're just saying, like, just let the bill be debated. And he's like, nope, fuck that. So you can see all these mistakes that he's made to get to this point. So that's the end. That's the last straw. And once there's direct, like, not only broken bones, but actually people getting killed, these guys become much more prominent. They do the lion's share of the fighting. Not literally these exact group, because there's even on the right in Ukraine, there's several different groups, and I maybe should talk about them now. But do I have them later? There's a whole spectrum. There's kind of conservatives, probably to the right of the Republican Party here. I guess I don't really know how to map that precisely. I don't know if I should even try. There are the outright neo-Nazis. There are kind of softer neo-Nazis. There's like the Svoboda Party and right sector who claim to be like Ukrainian nationalists, and in the context that they support Ukrainian nationalism, they support people who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II to fight the Russians. But they're still saying like, no, they were fighting the Russians. Like they were allying with the Nazis, but it was out of convenience. They were Ukrainian patriots, and they're fighting the Russians. And by the way, we're also holding up pictures of Hitler, and these two things are not related. Like we're not, you know. So it's a little bit. They're not going around like doing the same salutes. It's a little bit softer. It's a little bit more subtle. And then there's other elements of the Maidan who are completely against the Nazis and, you know, don't want to associate with them at all. And then there's elements that are more like, you know, we're nationalists, we're for our nation, and, you know, they don't really, I don't think, have a complex opinion about, you know, collaborators in World War II or fascism. So but all of those people, the whole kind of right part of Maidan that was, you know, initially small and has now become larger, becomes really decisive in getting rid of Yanukovych. And this is eventually what happens. There is a weird episode in the middle of February, where about 150 people are killed by snipers' bullets in the center of Kiev, and nobody knows who did it. It was probably the government. It could have been like a third force trying to like provoke the two sides to start fighting each other. But at any rate, like this is like when it's a military situation, these guys are the ones like, you know, bringing out the guns that they had in their closet and taking aim. And eventually, Yanukovych flees the country. He's in Russia now. I think that's where he went. So that's the end of his presidency. It is absolutely not the end of the crisis, though, as we're going to see. So there's a new government takes over, and it's not, you know, people have called it like a coup or something like that. It's not a coup in like the traditional sense of, you know, tanks firing on like the parliament or like forcible removal. I mean, the guy did leave the country technically of his own free will. He actually could have stayed still after that. There were plans to like negotiate with him through a third party, and he was just gone. So that, I mean, I guess that's his last mistake. That's the last thing he like, you know, even after that, people were like, well, okay, we can still talk with you, but he was gone. So there's a new government, and they held a new election in May. But before that can even happen, just when there's this kind of interim transitional government, these right forces, right sectors, Svoboda, people like this, and Ukrainian patriots, all these people, they get a lot more power in the government because they were the foot soldiers. They were the people who were there, you know, from the beginning, like running everything, and then later on they stepped up. You know, a lot of their people were killed. They sacrificed themselves to get rid of Yanukovych, and they get top billing, and not top billing, but they get a lot more influence in the new government. I think the Minister of Defense, which is kind of a big deal, he is a member of right sector. There's rightists in the agriculture, the fisheries guy, probably a Nazi. There's a few others that I can't forget. They're scattered throughout the cabinet, and they have much larger presence in the parliament now. So this and a number of other complex reasons leads Putin to seize the Crimea, because he's saying this is an unstable situation. We have a military base there. It's, you know, our national interest. We're going to take control of this piece of land, and that is, you know, strategically important to us. And we're going to demand that Yanukovych, you know, be returned, and that this illegitimate government be, you know, gotten rid of, and that there be safe and fair elections and everything. At least that's what he says. And Putin's motives in all this are kind of, that would be another like hour-long lecture, exactly what Putin's game is here, because the Crimea is not like some sort of key to anything. It's kind of a poor region. They do have a naval base there. There is some sort of talk of like gas pipelines going through there, but it's very poor. It relies on subsidies to like, you know, get by. It's connected to Ukraine way more than it is to Russia. Fresh water has to come from like mainland Ukraine. And let me actually bring that up so you can see what I'm talking about. So the Crimea is at the bottom there with the little, yeah. And it's marked that way because that's under Russian control. So yeah, and you can see there is a land connection, but it's very, very small. And I forget who it was. Was it like Gorbachev or somebody? Originally, that wasn't even part of Ukraine. It was given to the Ukrainian Socialist Federative Republic or whatever, like administratively before the Soviet Union fell. And there was a lot of kind of, you know, because the Crimea was the site of a pretty tremendous battle in World War II, and it was sort of like this, it's like, I don't know, giving away, if we were to give up Iwo Jima or something like that, or I don't know, like a part of New Jersey or some you know, some important like battle site for us like that. There was a lot of like pride connected to giving that to Ukraine, and so this is like the first place that Russia would take back if they were to take anything from Ukraine, because it's like 90% Russian speaking, and there's a huge Russian military base, and you know, it was Russian for, you know, a very, very long time. So Putin takes that, and that ratchets everything up. That brings everything up to the next level, because now it's, you know, this was not even really in the background. The protests were anti-Russian to begin with, but now Russia has literally intervened in Ukrainian affairs, and now the government is, you know, getting all militant. and talking about disenfranchising the Russian minority in Ukraine. They try to pass laws. The right sector tries to get laws passed that would like make Russian an illegal language or remove its status or something, which is ridiculous. It's like there's no comparison to even what it would be like here. Making speaking Spanish illegal or something, sort of, not really. But there's a large minority of people who speak Russian and consider themselves culturally Russian. Everybody knows Russian. Ukrainian and Russian aren't that different to begin with. So to kind of, banning
French in Canada.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I can't think of another country where everybody speaks 2 languages though. I don't know, maybe some country in Africa where everybody speaks like 7 languages or something. To ban one of them is like pointless, I don't know, something like that. Where was I? There's a presidential election after this on May 25th, 2014. And by this point, the East is kind of broken off. The protests in the East have gone up to the next stage, and I'm gonna talk about that later, or next actually. So there's no voting whatsoever in the East. This is a purely like Western Ukrainian election, and it's like the lowest turnout of any Ukrainian election since independence, 60%, which I think is fairly high. I was kind of surprised to read that. 60% of people who could vote voted, and that was like the lowest turnout. I don't know what it is in the US. I think it's probably, it's tiny. I thought that was funny to read. Like, people talk about how broken Ukrainian democracy is, and then they vote like double as, twice as much as we do. Yeah, or I hope that's right. I look like an idiot if it isn't. So Poroshenko is this guy's name, the guy who wins the election, Petr Poroshenko. He is one of the billionaires. He is in favor of integrating with the EU. That's the only thing that's known really about him, aside from the fact that he's very rich. His membership, what he thinks about NATO is not quite firm yet. What he thinks about the Ukraine, or what he thinks about the Crimea, and how he wants to confront Putin, none of that is really clear. All we know is that he was a participant in the Maidan protests. That's why he got elected, because he was one of the first people to come out and support the protesters, and he gave speeches there all the time, so people remember him. And he took a strong stand, obviously, against Yanukovych for his going back on his promise to join the EU. But it's interesting, Ukrainians are already skeptical of him. Obviously, the Russian part of Ukraine they don't even respect the election as legitimate, because it was done while there was like an active campaign to pacify eastern parts of the country that, I should just turn this off, it's ridiculous. Pacify the eastern parts of the country that were like in open revolt. So obviously you can't have a presidential election when, the army is invading like Utah. You can't do that. So the Russians don't respect it, but even ordinary Ukrainians are looking at this pattern now. Oligarchs all throughout the 90s, the Orange Revolution that gets rid of one set of oligarchs, replaces it with another. Yanukovych, nakedly corrupt guy. Poroshenko, extremely rich, has a lot of money offshore. His commitment to Ukraine is not, his commitment to Europe is very obvious. His commitment to Ukraine and like Ukrainian economy and jobs is not as certain, because again, he's one of these billionaires. He's taken care of. He has his money offshore. His goal now is to get that out of Ukraine. So, and there's already, Facebook, like little images that people have made of like his face fading into Yanukovych's, and they're, like kind of like doing that and like fading into all these other different oligarchs over time. So people are already skeptical, but that's sort of par for the course for Ukrainian politics. If somebody gets elected, it's half of the electorate at minimum. In this case, probably more is going to be against them, like, or suspect them of double dealing and being a jerk. So now we're going to talk about the East, and this starts before the presidential election, shortly after the seizure of Crimea in May, and let's see if I can pull up a picture here. Right, dudes. So this is a great picture. Not just because of all the flags, but not just because of like what the flags are, but because of the diversity here. There's like a Soviet naval ensign in the middle, right? There's a old like Peter the Great era Russian flag, I think. The one that looks like the Confederate flag, but it's blue and white. I think the one with the writing on it is, there's all kinds of red flags, obviously, with hammers and sickles everywhere. I think that says Russia on it. That could be like an old school Soviet flag, like of a republic. And then you can see, obviously, a straight up Russian flag in the background there. And then there's all kinds of different political party flags. So this is a great image because the movement in the East, like the protest movement in the East that's against the, what they call the junta in Kiev, is also as diverse as the Maidan protesters were. There's Russian nationals who have come over the border and like brought weapons, and they're probably volunteers. People are, saying that Putin is like orchestrating everything. There was an Economist cover that showed like this this guy like with his hand up like this, like the end of Platoon or whatever, and there's like this burning building behind him, and it says like it's something like Mr. Putin's latest show or something like that. I forget. It was this really obvious thing, like Putin is responsible for all this death and destruction. He's the one who's kind of like controlling the situation. It's very likely that he's not doing that, but there are a large amount of like Russian nationals who have crossed the border to fight with, because if you look at it, it's right next to Russia, right? The Russian Fed surrounds Ukraine on three sides. So there's a lot of Russian nationals who probably have family and friends that are living in Ukraine and feel the need to defend them, or they're straight up Russian nationalists and they want to steamroll the Ukrainians all the way to Kiev and take over what they consider to be like the mother of Russian cities. There's like this idea of, and it's not an idea, I mean, the first like Russian state in history in the 12th century was in the middle of this, right? It was around Kiev. Like the first people to call themselves Russians lived in present-day Ukraine. So there is this kind of tenuous nationalist connection. It's sort of like, not to like draw this comparison bluntly, but it's like the Germans during World War II thought that they were reclaiming the East, that they had been there before, and then we left, and now we're just going back. And this is sort of, so there's people like that in the Eastern insurgency that are like there to take over Ukraine. And then there's people who are there just for regional autonomy, who are afraid and have probably a good reason to be afraid of the new people in power in Kiev, the Nazis. That's a big thing for the East, because I mean it's a big thing in general, but the specific thing is like they venerate these people like Stephen Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis. And for a lot of people in the East who consider themselves still like Soviet citizens, like the victory over the Nazis in World War II is like the thing that's like the defining element of like the Soviet kind of identity. To see somebody that is technically in your elected government, who is openly like, saying, kind of going back and forth about the Nazis, or making the Nazi salute in public, or venerating these people that you think are collaborators, that's a no-go. That's a complete. I almost said it was a turnoff, but that's probably a little bit too soft of a word. It's like a direct attack on these people in their history. So that's the first thing. So there's a lot of diversity in this movement. Let's look at this. This is one of their protest barricades. This is like the action. You can see that is a. If you can't see that, that's a swastika with a line through it. It's not a swastika. And this is probably one of the only places on Earth right now where you would have to explain that, where you would have to say, no, that's not a swastika that somebody's holding up because they're a Nazi. It's somebody's put a line through it. Like it's, they're not Nazis. This is like one of the only places on Earth where you would have to say that. Mm-hmm. And then, if you look at the flag in the back.
That's an Albanian emblem.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's like the double-headed eagle. That's like Byzantine kind of descendant. Yeah, I think there's a few of those. But that's the point. Like, there's no hammer and sickle on this flag. It's a people's republic, but it has this kind of aristocratic, old-school type symbology on the flag. And they're anti-Nazi, but they're not necessarily like leftist, I guess. This is not a movement that that people are like in favor of the Soviet Union. They wish it was back. But the Soviet Union for them doesn't necessarily represent socialism. It represents this great nation that was like powerful and was able to compete on the stage with other nations. And that is sort of what these people's republics, I think, that's what a lot of the symbology refers to. Yeah.
They have a term for Tsarist generals who supported the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a radish.
A radish.
Yeah, because they were red on the outside.
And white on the...
But white on the inside.
Okay.
And there was this common phenomenon that these generals had realized, who otherwise would have been white Russians, were like, well, the Tsar's fallen, only the Bolsheviks are going to win, so it's our job to join them to make a greater Russia strong again.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like the...
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, the aristocratic element is, I guess, gone. But there's still a lot of these like leftover symbols from that. I think most people in this region are actually like more proletarian than any other part of Ukraine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that like when they talk about the Soviet Union, when they like venerate it or try to defend it from people who are attacking it, they're not doing it in like this specifically like socialist thing. And one of the ways you can tell is that there's a lot of large enterprises in these two provinces that haven't been nationalized, and people have suggested that. There was this point where they went up to one of the oligarchs' house and like were banging on his door, and representatives of one of these people's republics showed up and said, no, it's not the time yet. Like, or they didn't even say that. They said like, this isn't right. We need to do this a different way or something like that. So there were people making a demand for what you would think would be like a hallmark of a return to a Soviet-style economy, and they were a little bit leery of that. And one of them, this is my favorite thing. I didn't write down which one it was. One of them outlawed abortion on the grounds that human rights begin at conception, which is a straight up like religious thing. And that same one also has there's a state church. It's like the Moscow Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church or whatever. So it's a people's republic, but it has this official like declared state church. So that to me, that sort of represents like one of the big contradictions in like this Eastern kind of movement. Everybody says it's directed from Russia, and it's probably not, even though a lot of Russians feel like sympathy with Russians in Ukraine. And there was this one article on Al Jazeera that said this is Karl Marx's last stand. Like this tiny little war is Karl Marx's last stand, and it's like, well, I wish, I don't know, it's not really, it doesn't seem to be going in that direction. To have a people's republic, but also to have like an official church, it doesn't really, I don't know what Marx would have said about that. So, anyway, that is about it. If I can think of anything else. I was going to go into like Putin's motivations and like possible CIA involvement, and like all these, like who the snipers were, during January or February. But I think a lot of that stuff is, if we ever find out about it, it's going to be 10 or 15 years from now. And it's enough to talk about like, Putin needs a victory. He needs to like prove to people that he can defend Russia, from the rest of the world, but he cannot afford to get into an armed conflict, doesn't want to. And he has no interest in taking over Ukraine. He wants somebody who's not going to join NATO, basically, and isn't going to talk shit about Russians. And as long as that is there, like, he's happy. I think he's okay with what he has. He has enough on his plate. But that doesn't stop people from speculating. And I wanted to get into that a little bit, but I don't know. I think the information we have right now isn't very good. So. Are there any questions about any part of this? Did I get to all the pictures? Oh, no. These are Russian volunteers. Sorry. This is actually from the war in Georgia a few years ago, but it's the same people. You can see this word here. Vostok, that's east. The East Battalion, they were like a kind of informal, like paramilitary in the Russian military, and now they're fighting with these separatists in these people's republics. So, and one of them you see like the weapons. You also see the guy with his phone, like, taking a picture for Facebook. So, That's my favorite part of that picture. Yeah.
So I know that also in this, in kind of the same area where a lot of this is happening, there are like official leftist parties.
Right.
Involved. Like there's, I can't remember how to say it. It's like Baroque.
Baroque, yeah.
Did you find anything like significant on that?
Yeah, actually, part of the notes came from an interview with one of those guys. I didn't really talk about that. They have not had as much influence in these things. It's difficult to find like a leftist side to the protest. There's probably more of that in the eastern. There's none of that whatsoever. The protests in the Maidan were completely neoliberal and anti-Russian and like Western oriented from the very beginning. And there was a point where one of these, or two of these activists from that organization were on the street in Kiev, like passing out like leaflets in favor of trade unions, and they got like the shit kicked out of them like in late November, before any of this stuff went down. They were trying to participate in the protest, and they were like singled out and excluded. So that happened in the western part of Ukraine. The eastern part, I think it's more complicated. There is like a push for nationalization, for taking back, the people's resources from these oligarchs. But you could read that as a kind of a nationalist thing too, not necessarily leftist. Not that those two things can't ever intersect, but I think in this case it's more of like, the people, like our Russian, soil is being, it belongs to us. It's, and this oligarch is doing these horrible things. So I think if there were to be any sort of leftist influence, it would be in the East. But I know the leader of that party he had to leave the country, and a lot of people are kind of underground. So
that they were all in hiding.
Yeah. So, and definitely in the western part of the country they would be. And in the eastern part of the country, it's not like even being a civilian is difficult now in the East, because they're bombing indiscriminately and using white phosphorus and stuff like that. So being a leftist would be hard there, but just being like a normal person would be difficult too. So
It's kind of awkward.
yeah, it's very awkward.
I guess one question I would have on it is going back on Putin a little bit here. It seems like he's a real hard party liner for his representative group in Russia, but the odd thing is that you kind of see this in like, well, at least I see it a lot, like how the depiction of how they would put Russia against the U.S., like whole Cold War idea.
Right. Yeah.
It's just really crazy because it's like, is this some kind of like ramp up to something bigger? Is what I wonder. Because they're making it sound like, Russia being big bad there, like always, just storming into some place without thinking about it.
Right.
But when you look at it with all the info in front of you, it's kind of like, okay, well, as far as Western media goes on it would make it kind of, I don't know how to really word that, but it just makes the Western media look like such jerks, for the way they depict it.
Right. Because, and this is one of the interesting things, like Ukraine is on the border with Russia. And the borders between, like, this Cold War mentality, it used to split Germany in half, and there was, like Czechoslovakia. And all these Warsaw Pact countries are now either members of NATO or, moving in that direction. And so for Putin, I think maybe it is going to something bigger. Maybe there is going to be a military conflict over the Crimea. Maybe he is going to intervene in eastern Ukraine. I don't think any of that's going to happen. But this is sort of like the bigger thing, like the ramp up sort of already happened, because this buffer that Russia got for itself after World War II, of all these countries that were in its sphere, like that's gone. And now the U.S. has like kind of encroached consistently, like all through these countries that used to be Soviet, allies, and now they're in Ukraine, and this new Poroshenko dude might join NATO. So, and you're talking about the media, like the media depicting Putin as this big bad monster. He's not a nice guy. He is not, I don't know, he's just a shrewd politician, but to say that the U.S. is like not the bigger bully, I think is inaccurate. Maybe Putin would love to be a bigger bully. He just doesn't have enough power. Maybe that's the only thing that's preventing him. But the way that the U.S. has expanded towards Russia and the kind of moves that it's made, they're trying to isolate Russia, destroy it economically, and reduce Putin's ability to control his own country. And that's their objective. That's what they're doing. So for the Western media to be like, point the finger at big bad Putin for defending his doorstep is like, well, it's a little, it's a little bit like what would be the response if, we don't even have to ask, like, what was the response when, Khrushchev sent nuclear missiles to Cuba? Like, what was, it wasn't even bordering the U.S. And the response was like almost, this full-on war.
Yeah, that's cool.
So, whereas putting a missile defense system, in Eastern Europe and putting military bases there is fine, and if Putin objects, then he's the bad guy. So, anyway, I read this book recently that said that U.S.-Russian relations were actually better during the Soviet Union because they were both really powerful, and they both hated each other, and there was this kind of like mutual respect. And now that like it was based on like nuclear weapons, right? It was, that's what the respect was based on. But now that Russia is less powerful, like there's not even a pretense of respect for Russia's goals, or there's no consultation with them. We just do things and they find out about it. We just, they don't have any interests that are legitimate. Our interests are the only ones that are legitimate. So.
Kind of the irony that, we respect them as long as they have the potential to destroy us.
Right. Yeah. Like, how do you gain the respect of the U.S.? It's like, well, I guess you get nukes. I don't know. That's so. Anyway, is that? Oh, I thought you were.
Oh, sorry. I real quick, but
Yeah.
So you didn't want to speculate on Russia's motivation. What do you think the political economy of Russia is, and what do you think that plays into Russia in general and Putin's kind of actions in this area? You mentioned that he doesn't have any desire to like take eastern Ukraine. Is that because Russia is still like dominated by foreign countries? Is it that it's now reached a level of capitalism or state capitalism, or does it have like imperial ambitions of its own that it sees Ukraine as a threat to?
I think, it would have imperial ambitions if it had like a larger population, like a stronger military and a better position overall. I think that's, that would be like, if Russia was better off, they would try to do that. Putin would try to do that. But right now, I think he's in a defensive kind of stance. And I think as far as Russia's political economy, that like this eastern region of Ukraine is a lot of industry, but it's not, it relies on a lot of state subsidies. And it's not particularly rich in minerals or something that would give Russia like an edge over something else. They already have like a lot of oil and a lot of gas and a lot of minerals of their own. Their problem is that there's like a demographic collapse in the country, and the economy is being run for, it used to be run completely for a certain set of oligarchs. Now it's, again, a different set of oligarchs, and they're a little bit more under Putin's control. But the economy is not in any state to really support like imperial ventures. And I think there's a lot of domestic pressure on Putin to do something about the Ukraine. And I think he has to kind of, he's a little bit worried about his own position in Russia, I think. He has to like prove to people that he's strong enough. And if he isn't strong enough, he's going to face like a color revolution of his own, I think. And I think that's kind of what's informing his moves here, because he's like moved, people have been tracking like Russian army formations, like moving towards the border and then back again and then like shuffling around. He's not, if he were a conqueror, if he were like going in there like, we need to project power and do all these things, he would have done a lot more, I think, than he's done. I think he's trying to like keep a lid on things as much as he can, but at the same time like not appear to be like a weak leader. It's sort of like the wag the dog type thing. The Crimea is sort of his, foreign adventure to like get his, or like the Falklands War or something. It's like his little like military victory abroad to like increase his prestige without really changing things or putting too much pressure on other people that could really hit back. So.
Another question is, do you see this as an attempt for the United States and the EU to like preemptively destroy the ability of Russia to kind of become an imperial power? Because it seems like in the mid-90s, right, it was like fire sale everywhere in the Soviet Union, including Russia. But now there's been like a consolidation of capital in Russia under domestic oligarchs. The oligarchs who wanted to see capital flight to the United States, to the EU, it seems like have lost out.
Yeah.
And the new set of oligarchs, which Putin represents, want to build capital and power in Russia. We see this as sort of like a preemptive attempt by other imperialist powers to kind of keep Russia like as, you know, as a weak nation to be, that can't threaten their interests globally, because, you know, we saw Putin arming, for example, Syria.
Yeah.
And, you know, thwarting the United States adventure there.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would love to see Russia as destroyed as it was in the early 90s. I think that was like the perfect time for like U.S. imperialism. That was the end of history. That was like the time when the U.S. was triumphant. And I think they want to get back to that. I don't know specifically, because it seems like Putin he's made pretty smart moves in the past. Like, I think this is one situation where he could fuck it up, but he absolutely embarrassed the U.S. in Georgia. He stopped the dismemberment, or tried to stop like Syria from falling apart, and prevented the U.S. from intervening there, basically. So, I mean, I think it's not really preemptive, because he already has some level of power, I think, on his own. I think now it's just sort of like a great game type situation again, but Russia is still relatively weak. It can't, like, it doesn't have its own proxies, like, Russia doesn't have bases in Mexico or something like that. That would be the equivalent, I think, to the way that the U.S. is treating Russia. So, was there another part? I feel like I didn't answer that completely.
Well, I mean, part of it is, do you see them as preemptively trying to stop Russian formations? I mean, if we look at it was great that you used the term the Great Game, right, which specifically refers to the struggle of imperialist powers in the 19th century, right? Russia always depended on sort of like local colonies and semi-colonies. They just talked about integrating into a greater Russian, they say it's an international customs union, but really, if we're honest, it's a Russian customs union. I mean, do you see that as like a move towards imperialism, Russian capital then being able to expand beyond its borders in ways that it can't now, to kind of integrate, to build, because the Tsarist Empire, was always focused on small islands in the east and, Slavic republics in the west. I mean, is this kind of like an extension of like an equivalent of like the weak Tsarist imperialism to like the modern day weakened Russian imperialism, or do you still think that they haven't reached that point?
I don't think they've reached that point, because I think for Putin, he is like, there's a domestic threat that comes from some of these like Russian nationalist people, pointing behind me, and I think he is only doing as much as or as little as he thinks he can get away with the Crimea. Because, I mean, the Ukrainian military is armed with like old Soviet equipment. It would be like, if you really did want to invade the Ukraine, really did want to like, or just conduct a peacekeeping operation and then leave like a really compliant government in Kiev. If you really wanted to do that, he could, and they could slice through him like hot butter. It's sort of like the U.S. invading Iraq. Like with, we have the modern weapons and they have like the 30-year-old stuff that we sold them, 20 years ago or something. And I think if it was a stronger imperialism, he would have done that, or he would have made moves in that way. I mean, he's drawn troops like back from the border, to like reduce the, the possibility that he's accused of intervening. So, I don't know. I mean, I think he's trying to he's just sitting on the kettle a little bit right now and waiting for things to blow over. I think the financial crisis also may have like knocked back whatever kind of imperial ambitions Russia had, because a lot of what Russia sells now is like energy, and when the economy goes down, their ability to like make money off of energy resources goes down as well. so that, I mean, that could have had a, you know, a damper on it. There's still, I don't think there's like a strong like force in Russia that is unified and like pushing for like expansion of Russian capital just yet. I mean, there may be, but the force from the other direction is so strong that I think right now they're just kind of playing defense. So.
Just looking at some of the map earlier when I was thinking about it. It's kind of strange because I was looking at strategically from where the Russian Federation is in the Black Sea area, and I was thinking that so much like a fishing industry and offshore oil, things like that, within the international water areas, that really if Russia could annex Crimea and keep it, that expands their international, maritime borders, which could incorporate some of the oil rigs and stuff like that, which that could be, an ideal situation for the Russians. But ultimately, wouldn't that be more of the people that back Putin? I mean, financially or politically, that they could be the ones controlling that behind the scenes. I mean, it's could be like an underlying factor that nobody's really paid attention to.
Yeah, well, with the energy stuff, I mean, Russia already has a huge amount of oil and gas. They're already like the main supplier to Europe, and increasingly to China. They're building pipelines into China now. So getting more oil, I mean, it would improve their position, I guess, globally, but it's not. I don't think it's a priority for Putin, because I mean, that's one of his. If you look at like the cards that he has, like oil is a big card that he already has, in his deck. I really think, I mean, because the Crimea is not economically by itself very significant.
No, but I mean, just looking at their position. Though,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It would make sense if they had naval bases there.
Yeah, and that's actually, I mean, Russia has bases in Syria too, or a base, and that was almost cut off during the this revolution. So I think that may have been on Putin's mind, like the kind of strategic aspect of it, like where are our bases, that sort of thing. But that is still, I don't know. The Russian fleet isn't like colonizing Alaska and yeah.
It just was a thought.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's all right.